Hello, are boundaries selfish walls or sacred protection? If you've ever felt guilty for choosing your peace, this episode of the Everyday Faith podcast with Dr. DeJoy is for you. Let's talk about godly boundaries, emotional safety, and the power of saying no without apology. And this comes from Beautifully Broken, Healing Broken Hearts by Dr. DeJoy. And we're going to go into talking about boundaries on today. And so hold on just a moment. Don't go away. We'll be right back. We're going to start talking about boundaries, and we're going to use and actually we're going to use this podcast to do it. I thought it was very good. It really focuses really heavily on talking about boundaries and how they affect us. Don't go away. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so now. We look forward to having you join us as we continue on talking about
Imagine
boundaries.
this scenario. You have a friend, let's call him Mark. Mark is going through a rough patch, and he calls you every night at 10 p.m. to vent. You're exhausted, you have an early meeting, you are spiritually drained, but you pick up the phone. Why? Because you tell yourself that being a good person, a spiritual person, means being endlessly available. You tell yourself that saying no would be selfish, maybe even a betrayal of your values. But here is the question: is that actually compassion? Or is it just martyrdom with good PR?
That is the classic trap, isn't it? We mistake self abandonment for holiness. We think that if we just bleed enough for other people, we'll eventually find peace. But the reality is the exact opposite. If you don't have a fence around your yard, you don't have a garden, you have a public park. And you can't cultivate anything deep or sacred in a space that everyone is trampling through.
Welcome to the show. I'm Eleanor. Today we are dissecting one of the most misunderstood concepts in modern wellness and spirituality: boundaries. We're going to look at why safeguarding your personal peace isn't just a psychological necessity, but actually a spiritual imperative. And joining me to break this down is Sophie.
It's great to be here, Eleanor. This topic is huge because it sits right at the intersection of mental health and spiritual maturity. There is this pervasive myth that boundaries are these cold, hard walls we build to shut people out. But I want to flip that immediately. A boundary isn't a wall, it's a gate. And a gate has a very specific function. It lets the good in and keeps the bad out. It's a filtration system for your soul.
I love that distinction: a gate, not a wall. But let's go back to that feeling of guilt I mentioned in the opener. I think a lot of us, especially if we were raised in certain religious or altruistic traditions, have this deep seated belief that boundaries are inherently selfish. We're taught to turn the other cheek, to go the extra mile. So, historically speaking, where does this idea of personal boundaries even come from? Is it just a modern invention?
That's a fascinating question. If you look at the timeline, the explicit psychological language of boundaries is actually quite recent. It really exploded in the 1980s with the self help movement and the recovery movement, particularly regarding codependency. Authors like Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend really popularized this in the Christian world with their book Boundaries in the early 90s. They argued that boundaries were biblical, that God Himself has boundaries.
Wait, God has boundaries? That sounds counterintuitive if you think of the divine as this infinite, all loving force.
But look at the structure of creation narratives. In Genesis, for example, the very first act of creation is separation: light from dark, land from sea. It's about definition. Without that separation, you just have chaos. And if you look at the life of Jesus in the New Testament, he's often cited by theologians as a master of boundaries. There are multiple accounts, like in the Gospel of Luke, where crowds are pressing in on him, demanding healing, demanding attention. And what does he do? He withdraws to lonely places to pray. He literally walks away from people who need him to safeguard his own connection with the divine.
That is such a powerful reframing. He wasn't walking away because he didn't care. He was walking away because he had to recharge the source of his care. It reminds me of the oxygen mask analogy on airplanes. You have to put yours on first.
Exactly. But let's go deeper than the oxygen mask because that's a bit of a cliche. Let's look at it through a Buddhist lens. There is a concept introduced by the Tibetan meditation master Chogyam Trungpa called idiot compassion.
Idiot compassion? That is incredibly blunt. Please explain that.
It is, isn't it? But it's brilliant. True compassion, what they call grandmother's compassion, is wise. It wants what is best for the other person in the long run. Idiot compassion is when you give people exactly what they want because you can't bear the discomfort of saying no. It's enabling. If you have an alcoholic friend who asks for money, giving it to them stops their immediate suffering, sure, but it feeds the addiction. That is idiot compassion. It's actually selfish because you're doing it to make yourself feel like a good person and to avoid conflict, rather than doing the hard thing that might actually help them.
Oof, that hits hard. So, in that sense, a boundary is actually an act of respect. It's saying, I respect you enough not to enable you, and I respect myself enough not to resent you.
Precisely. Resentment is the biggest red flag that a boundary has been crossed. Nidra Glover Tawwab, who wrote Set Boundaries, Find Peace, talks about this extensively. She says that resentment is the emotion of envy. We are envious of the person who is taking from us because they are prioritizing their needs, and we aren't prioritizing ours. When you feel that tightening in your chest, that bitterness when the phone rings, that is your body screaming that a boundary is needed.
Let's get technical for a minute. You mentioned the body. What is actually happening physiologically when we fail to set boundaries? Because it feels like a stress response.
It is a stress response. When you are in a state of constant compliance, saying yes when you mean no, your nervous system detects a threat. You are essentially betraying your own intuition. This triggers the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight. But since you aren't fighting, saying no, and you aren't fleeing, leaving the situation, you often go into a fawn response. You try to appease the threat. Chronically doing this leads to high cortisol levels, burnout, and what psychologists call compassion fatigue. You literally deplete the neurochemicals required to feel empathy.
So, by trying to be everything to everyone, we biologically incapacitate our ability to actually care for anyone. That is the ultimate irony.
And that is why I say safeguarding personal peace is a spiritual imperative. You cannot do your work in the world, whatever that work is, if your internal house is on fire. You need a safe container.
I want to pivot to the how because this is where people get stuck. We intellectually understand we need boundaries, but in the moment, the words stick in our throats. We're afraid of the reaction, we're afraid of being abandoned. How do we actually structure a boundary without it blowing up in our faces?
Well, first we have to distinguish between a boundary and a request. This is a common point of confusion. A request is asking someone else to change their behavior. Please stop criticizing my cooking. A boundary is telling someone what you will do in response to that behavior. If you criticize my cooking, I will stop cooking for you. Do you see the difference?
Yes, one depends on them complying, and the other depends on you taking action. That circles back to Stoicism, doesn't it? Focusing on what you can control.
Exactly. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher, taught that our peace is disturbed not by things themselves, but by our view of them, and specifically by trying to control things outside our sphere of influence. You cannot control if your mother in law makes a passive aggressive comment. You can control whether you stay in the room to hear it. A healthy boundary puts the power back in your hands.
Okay, but what happens when people weaponize this? I've seen a trend lately, often called therapy speak, where people use the language of boundaries to be controlling or avoidant. Like, I'm setting a boundary that you can't be sad around me because it affects my vibe. Is that a boundary?
No, that is control masquerading as a boundary. And this is a really important nuance. A boundary is about your behavior and your safety. It is not a tool to dictate how other people feel or express themselves. Saying you can't be sad is controlling. Saying I can't be your primary emotional support right now because I'm overwhelmed, but I can talk for 10 minutes is a boundary. The cutoff culture we're seeing, where people just ghost friends and call it a boundary, is often just avoidance. Real boundaries usually involve negotiation and communication, not just slamming the door.
That distinction is crucial. It seems like true boundary setting requires vulnerability. You have to admit, I have a limit. I am not infinite. And for a lot of us, admitting weakness is harder than enduring abuse.
It is. It requires admitting our humanity. But that humility is also where spiritual growth happens. When we acknowledge our limits, we stop trying to play God. We stop trying to be the savior for everyone. We accept that we are finite beings. And strangely, that acceptance creates space. When you aren't cluttered with everyone else's demands, you actually have room to hear your own inner voice or God, or the universe, however you frame it. Silence requires protection.
I'm thinking about the different types of boundaries. We've talked about emotional ones, but what about time and energy? I feel like in the digital age, our boundaries are more porous than ever because we are accessible 24/7.
Oh, absolutely. The digital age has eroded the physical boundaries that used to protect us. 50 years ago, if you left work, you left work. Now, the office is in your pocket. This is why rigid boundaries, which are usually seen as bad, can sometimes be necessary. Nedra Tawwab talks about porous, rigid, and healthy boundaries. Porous is I can't say no. Rigid is I never let anyone in. Healthy is flexible based on context. But with technology, I'd argue we sometimes need to be rigid. No screens after 9 p.m. has to be a hard rule for many people to preserve their sleep and sanity. That isn't being closed off, that's protecting the biological machinery that allows you to be spiritual in the first place.
Let's talk about the fallout because when you start setting boundaries, especially if you've been a people pleaser your whole life, people get mad. The ecosystem shifts. How do we handle the guilt that comes when we actually upset people we love?
That reaction is inevitable. If people benefited from your lack of boundaries, they aren't going to like it when you install them. It's like changing the locks on a house where everyone had a key. They're going to bang on the door. The key here is to normalize the discomfort. Just because you feel guilty doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. Guilt is often just a symptom of breaking a social script you were trained to follow. You have to reframe the guilt as growing pains.
I like that. Guilt is a symptom of breaking a script. So if I say no to that dinner party and I feel a pang in my stomach, that's not my conscience telling me I'm bad. It's my conditioning telling me I'm disobedient.
Exactly. And obedience is not the same as virtue. That is a critical distinction. Obedience is doing what you're told, virtue is doing what is right. Sometimes what is right is saying, I love you, but I cannot help you with this. I remember reading about a study in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships that showed clear communication of boundaries actually increased relationship satisfaction over time because people feel safer. They don't have to guess what you're thinking, they know where they stand.
It creates safety. That makes so much sense. If I know you'll tell me no when you need to, then I can trust your yes. If I suspect your yes is just you being polite, I can never really trust that you want to be there.
Yes, an honest no validates every future yes. It infuses your presence with intention. When you show up, you are actually there, not just your body while your mind is resentfully calculating how soon you can leave. That presence is the essence of spiritual connection. You can't connect spirit to spirit if you're hiding behind a mask of compliance.
So let's walk through a practical example. Let's go back to Mark, the friend who calls every night at 10 p.m. I've decided I need to stop this. I'm terrified. What do I actually say? Do I use the sandwich method? Compliment, boundary, compliment?
The sandwich method can sometimes dilute the message. If the bread is too thick, they miss the meat. I prefer being direct and kind. You don't need to apologize excessively. You could say, Mark, I value our friendship and I want to support you, but I've realized that 10 p.m. is too late for me to be on the phone. I need to wind down then. Going forward, I won't be answering calls after 9 p.m., but I'd love to catch up on weekends. It's clear, it explains the why, my need for rest, without blaming him, you're too needy, and it sets the consequence. I won't answer.
And then the hard part, actually not answering when he calls at 10:05 p.m.
That is the hard part. A boundary without enforcement is just a suggestion. And this is where the spiritual rubber meets the road. Can you sit with the discomfort of his potential anger? Can you trust that the friendship is strong enough to survive a limit? If it isn't, if the friendship only exists because you have no needs, then it wasn't a friendship. It was a hostage situation.
Wow, a hostage situation. That really puts a fine point on it. It seems like this journey toward boundaries is really a journey toward authenticity. It's about peeling back the layers of who we think we should be to protect who we actually are.
And that is the definition of spiritual growth, isn't it? Moving from the false self, the persona, the pleaser, the martyr, to the true self, the self that is connected to the divine, the self that has unique gifts to offer. You can't offer your unique gifts if you're too busy doing everyone else's chores. Protecting your peace is protecting your potential.
This conversation has completely shifted my perspective. I used to think of boundaries as defensive, like putting up a shield. But hearing you talk, it feels more like gardening. It's weeding, it's pruning, it's making sure the soil has enough nutrients.
That is a beautiful analogy. And remember, a garden with a gate is still welcoming. It's just not a thoroughfare. You get to decide who comes in, how long they stay, and what they bring with them. That isn't selfish, it's stewardship.
Stewardship. That's the word to end on. We are stewards of our own souls. Sofie, thank you so much for this deep dive. You've given us permission to say no so that our yes can actually mean something.
It was my pleasure. Go build those gates.
And to everyone listening, check your fences, check your gates, and don't be afraid to close them when you need to. Your peace is worth protecting. Until next time.
Awesome. Thank you so much for listening today. Look, if you have not had a chance to subscribe to my channel, please do. I am on Podbean as well as YouTube, also on LinkedIn and Facebook. Find me under Dr. DeJoy. And please connect with me and subscribe. Thank you for listening. Until next time.